All right, guys, welcome to Section 10 of the Cybercrime course. Here is our funny internet picture of the day. It's funny because it's barbed wire. All right, so today we're talking about cyber war, cyber terror, other cyber extremist things. Similar to the last subject we talk about, harassing, stalking, and bullying, the definitions here are really, really difficult to draw nice, clear lines between what counts as terrorism, what counts as war, what counts as neither of the above, right? There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of does this count? Does this not count? It's very kind of gray area abundant, if that makes sense. But there are lots of different ways that people can use cyber domains for either terrorism or warfare or some kind of offensive action. The mild ones, these are just the very mild ones. We're going to talk about more extreme ones here in a minute. But at its kind of mildest, you can talk about hacktivism, right? This is where people use the internet or some kind of network communications to do some kind of activism, civil disobedience, creating flash mobs for some kind of political purpose. This is hacktivism, as most people define it, is not illegal. It doesn't quite reach the level of cyber terrorism or cyber war, but at some point it can get extreme enough to be illegal. It depends on what exactly that hacktivism results in. Is it organizing a protest, or is it hacktivism that ends up with people hurt and property destroyed, right? Vandalism is a big one. Cyber vandalism. You can attack government websites are a big target for vandalism. Political stuff, religious websites or services. A lot of these get vandalized in a fairly routinely, in a way that you can tell the person was they had some kind of political or religious ideological motivation in that destruction of essentially a website is internet property, right? Hopefully most websites are smart enough to have secure backups, so if your website does get vandalized, it's a relatively simple thing to restore the old version from the most recent backup. But some websites aren't smart enough to do that, and it can cause a lot of damage and time and energy. The other warfare terrorism stuff we can use are for communications, right? Terrorist cells need to communicate with each other, plan attacks, communicate about everything from personnel to money to all these things. And the internet is absolutely amazing as a tool for communications. That's what it is. It is the world's greatest communication network. So of course, both the good guys use it for communications, normal people use it for communications, but of course the bad guys are too. And it's very difficult to figure out what kind of communications are normal everyday communications and what kind of communications are by, for, or to terrorists or cyber warfare actions, right? Propaganda is a big thing, both for nation states and for terror groups. It is a big deal for recruiting and training, and as George Bush said prior to the Iraq War, it's about hearts and minds, right? It's all about the hearts and minds. So if you can use your propaganda to capture the hearts and minds of people, they're going to be more likely to support you and less likely to support your enemy. Whether you're a terror group or a nation state, and whether your enemy is a terror group or a nation state or a race, a religion, any kind of group you are or are fighting against, the more support you can get from other people, the better for you. And propaganda is a very important way to do that. And then, of course, there's fundraising, right? You can't fight a war or commit terrorist acts without money. You need money for training, you need money to pay people, you need money for explosives and all kinds of stuff. So the internet is a very effective tool for fundraising. Everything from cryptocurrencies to credit cards to laundering money to all kinds of money-related issues. The internet is absolutely incredibly useful for anybody, but unfortunately, one of those anybody's are terror groups. So today we're going to talk a little bit about cyber terrorism, and then in the next subsection we'll talk a little bit about cyber war. But this is a very, very complicated topic, and we're only really brushing the tip of this iceberg. Okay, so cyber activism, it doesn't necessarily have to be illegal. It doesn't necessarily have to be serious. So these are some of the either legal or relatively low-level things that cyber activists do a lot to kind of get their point across, to get their message out, to do their thing, right? So the first one is civil disobedience. There are, civil disobedience can be anything from blocking a roadway to chaining yourself to a tree, to protesting, to marching, to all kinds of different things. And lots of different groups have like training videos on how to perform this kind of civil disobedience, how to organize, how to march, how to chant, how to make sure the media sees it. That's a very important thing, right? We want CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and the local news and more cameras the better, because that gets your message out to a wider audience than most people could ever hope for, right? So there are lots of different training videos on how to perform these different civil disobedience acts. And that's not illegal. Obviously, if they're telling you to do something illegal, that might be illegal, but the vast majority of this is completely legal and does not violate any laws, especially here in the United States, where you're allowed to protest, you're allowed to march, you're allowed to do lots of things. But it is illegal in some places, right? So the Middle East, there was the Arab Spring. There was a lot of training on civil disobedience for them, and that was illegal in many of those places. A lot of groups have taken to creating video games where you play what some might call a terrorist. In the video game, you're a freedom fighter, and you're going out and you're shooting the members of the enemy group, or you're doing some other kind of work in this game for the good guys fighting against the bad guys, right? And that can be anything from working for one racial group against another racial group, working for one religion against another religion, working for one nation against another nation. But video games, because they're such a big and growing entertainment medium, and they really are fun for people to play of all ages, it is a very easy way to get your message out, especially among the young. If you can convince a very young person that your video game is really fun and they try it and they like it, they're going to absorb the message of the video game. And it's a way to kind of get people interested and active with your propaganda. Okay? Music is another big one. The racist right in the United States has been using that one for decades. They have entire music labels all for white supremacy, neo-Nazism, all kinds of kind of racist, white supremacist, nationalistic stuff. They get a lot of that out through music. Obviously, it's mostly rock music, heavy metal, that kind of thing. But everything, I heard white supremacist reggae once, which was very weird, but it exists. so they're using that music to spread their message and spread their propaganda and try to recruit people and get people to support their cause. Another thing, so everything kind of from there up is perfectly legal in most places. But now some of the kind of minor illegal things are things like vandalism, which we talked about in the last slide. This picture is a picture of the hacker group Anonymous defaced the website of a Syrian government agency. And essentially, I don't know if you can read that, it's fairly small type, but it says, to the Syrian people, the world stands with you against the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad, right? Which was the president, prince, something, leader of that country. And they're currently, as I'm recording this, in the middle of a civil war. But so that's kind of a good example of hacktivist vandalism for political purposes, for propaganda purposes, to try to get people to support your cause, in this case being against al-Assad, and to support that mission and that goal. Okay. And then on the end there is a DDoS, or distributed denial of service attack. Cyber activists love to use these. They will target the websites or the servers or some kind of computer network of the enemy, and overload it with data so that legitimate users can't access the services, whatever that may be, right? So we're going to talk in the next subsection about how Russia used that against Estonia back in the mid-2000s for a very successful activist attack. So cyber terrorism really falls into two different categories. Okay, there's state-sponsored terrorism and there's non-state-sponsored terrorism. So this slide is about the state-sponsored terrorism, meaning that some government is either performing it or encouraging it. And when it becomes state-sponsored terrorism that the nation state is actually performing itself, when does that go from terrorism to warfare, and when is it one and when is it the other? Great question. If you can come up with an answer, please let me know. But we know that nation states can commit cyber terror, and we know that nation states can commit cyber war, but it's not easily definable what the difference is. There's a lot of overlap again, right? So any nation state, if you want to be a nation state, if you want to commit state-sponsored terrorism, you have to have these three things: sovereignty, i.e., you rule something; territory, so some geographic area on the planet; and you have to have an abstract organization, right? So you have to have a leader and staffers and, a hierarchy, essentially. Some kind of organization. Now, interestingly, by that definition, I would argue that ISIS, or ISIL, depending on who you listen to, in the early 2010s was a sovereign nation. I mean, think about it. They had sovereignty over the territory they controlled, and they had an organization. Luckily, as I'm recording this, they're not nearly as powerful as they used to be, but while they met this definition, they weren't recognized as a nation state by most other nations, which I think ultimately is the real measure of whether you're a country or not. It's whether other countries agree you're a country, right? But state terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism can also be split up into two different categories, where is it some member of the government performing the act, or is the state merely encouraging private citizens to perform the act, right? So there's a difference between some military hacker unit getting tasked with performing some terrorist attack and some government agent talking to a private citizen and saying, hey, you should go attack such and such country. You should try to find this information out, or you should try to destroy this or take this offline, right? So sometimes the nation state, the organization, whether it's the military, law enforcement, their spies, whatever their version of the CIA is, that actually does it, and sometimes it's private organizations or private citizens within the country being encouraged by the government to commit these terroristic acts, right? And sometimes these terroristic acts can be destruction, whether it's destruction of information property or real world destruction, which we'll talk about how that works in a minute. Or it can be theft, spying, essentially. Are they just stealing? It can be economic data. It can be troop movements. It can be secrets. It can be any kind of theft of information that the nation state wants. Or it can be any kind of destruction that the nation state wants, right? So this picture is, this was actually broadcast on Chinese television, and it's kind of hard to see. Most of it's in Chinese, but they were doing an interview at a Chinese military facility, and at some point the camera caught this screenshot, and that right there, the 138.26.72, that is an IP address, which essentially identifies a specific computer or specific small network. And after this aired on Chinese television, American IT people saw that and decided to look up what that IP address corresponded to. And at the time this was filmed, that IP address corresponded to a university in the United States. So essentially we have video proof that Chinese military or government hackers are targeting American universities. It was broadcast on Chinese television. I don't think they understood what they were broadcasting. So they kind of accidentally broadcast this target, which is an American university. So obviously they're trying to find information and find and as a nation state, as a state-sponsored terrorist act, steal information from American universities. And I'm 99.9% sure that America is doing it back to China. This is kind of a game that all nations play if they're kind of on that level. So, non-nation state terrorism. These are just terroristic groups or people that want to commit some act, and they're able to use the internet to do all kinds of terroristic processes, whether it's the actual attack or whether it's the communications or the fundraising or whatever. But these guys, they generally have fewer resources than a nation state for what I hope are obvious reasons, right? I mean, if you start hanging out with your buddies and decide to commit some terroristic act, you're not going to have the money or the weapons or the explosives or the computer infrastructure or whatever that a country would. Even a small country like North Korea has way more resources than any terrorist group or terrorist individuals on the planet, right? So you're working with fewer resources, which makes it a little more difficult. But the internet gives you a lot of really good opportunities. I shouldn't say good opportunities, valuable to them opportunities for these terrorist groups. For instance, you can get your message to people, to the world, without use of the media, right? So 20, 30 years ago, if you were a terrorist group and you wanted to get your message out to people, you had to kind of go through the mass media, whether that was, some news television show, or whether it was the newspapers, or whether it was, some other media outlet. You relied on them to get your message to the people. Now, with the internet, there's no need for that. You can just upload a video to YouTube, and you have complete control over what is said and how it's said and what's shown and what's not shown. So it's kind of taken out the media as a middleman in getting a terrorist message from the terrorists to the people or whoever they want to talk to, right? Terrorist groups love to use the internet to kind of recruit and reinforce ideology, right? So they'll take some disgruntled young person who's kind of angry and searching for who they are, like most young people do, and most young people are, and radicalize them. They'll say, hey, I know you're angry. Well, you should be angry at this other group because they're the ones making your life hard. And when you're young and inexperienced and don't really know any better, a lot of times you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's that group that's making my life so difficult. And they use that to make you view that group as other, and kind of start hating that group, and it makes it much, and you get more extreme and more extreme and more extreme, and it very rarely ends with just, oh, I hate that group, oh, they're really bad. It gets to physical violence and becoming some kind of radical extremist offender, terrorist, essentially, right? And then when you do get to the radical point where you're like, I want to do something, I want to shoot somebody or bomb something or do some horrible act against these people because they're the enemy, you can then train them all over the internet, right? You can train people how to buy guns and clean guns and smuggle guns, or how to make homemade explosives, or how to, tactics for how to create the maximum amount of casualties or maximum amount of panic, or all that training, all that knowledge that terrorists need, that attackers need, can all be found right there on the internet. It's the same YouTube that can be used to train people on how to, how to carve wood and how to fix an engine, can also be used to train people how to blow up a building. And that's really scary, but that's the reality we live in today. So if you want to have some kind of real world effect, okay, we're not talking about just vandalism. We're not talking about just DDoSing somebody. We're not talking about just stealing information. We're talking about real world destruction, real world consequences, actual damage in the physical world. There are a lot of different things you can target. Okay, one of the more common or more obvious targets is the electrical grid and the power plants that supply them. Okay, as time goes on, we're getting more and more and more internet-based control of our power system, our electrical grid, our power plants, whether it's nuclear or coal or gas or solar, whatever. All of those different power plants and the electrical grid that takes the energy around the country is getting more and more and more internet enabled and networked. And unfortunately, when they were creating those systems, security was not exactly an important factor. So that leaves us very, very vulnerable. Now imagine that somebody was able to take out the power grid of the entire East Coast, everything from Chicago east. For an hour or two, might not be that big a deal. But now imagine that the power's out for days or weeks or months. Food spoils. People on life support die. People that need dialysis die. If it's winter, people freeze to death. If it's summer, people, without air conditioning or without cooling systems, die. People starve to death when the food all goes bad. There could be a very, very serious outcome for taking our electricity down for even moderate amounts of time. So that is looked at as a very important vulnerability for our country, and we need to put more protections on those systems. Oil pipelines, another big one. So modern oil pipelines, and there's 1,000 of them that crisscross the United States, and they spill oil all over the place all the time by accident. And those oil spills are incredibly both environmentally damaging to people, damaging to water sources. Now imagine somebody specifically attacked an oil pipeline to cause maximum disruption. It's not an accident anymore. It's on purpose, trying to make it as bad as possible. they could spill gazillions of gallons of oil in lots of different places, contaminating water, killing wildlife, killing people. Chemical storage facilities, there's lots of dangerous chemicals that are created and made for different industrial purposes. Those facilities are increasingly networked, increasingly connected to the internet. And if you can hack them, you can cause valves to open. You could release a bunch of poison gas into the air that could, float and take out a neighborhood and kill people. Water and sewage treatment plants. If you can poison the water remotely via the internet, that's, again, that can kill people. And then, of course, there's the banking or stock exchanges, our money, right? A sufficiently damaging attack could send our country into another Great Depression. If we don't protect ourselves and somebody is able to take out a significant chunk of our banking or stock exchange system, it could send the world into another Great Depression, which would be an absolutely huge deal, and people would die. People would have all kinds of negative effects beyond just, oh, my 401k is gone, right? I mean, that can be a very, very, very big deal. But what we really need to focus on are these SCADA systems. And I can't remember what SCADA stands for. You can look it up if you want to. But essentially, SCADA systems are the robots, the remote controls of all of the above lists, right? So at a car manufacturing plant, all of the little robots that come in and do the welding and put the doors on and do the painting and all that, all those robots are networked together so that you can control them or automate them or modify them from remotely, like from a terminal anywhere in the building, or if you're connected to the internet, anywhere in the world. Those SCADA systems that run all these industrial machinery, whether it's a valve open or close, or a robot arm that reaches out and grabs, or a spinning turbine at a power plant, or whatever, all of those SCADA systems, if they're connected to any kind of network, which most of them are these days, they're hackable. They're vulnerable. We need to have security that protects those things, because anybody who can hack into that system can then control those things. And if you start thinking about, if I had complete control over those things and wanted to cause as much damage as possible, what are the possibilities? It gets real scary real fast. There was a war game exercise where somebody broke into, as a war game in the United States, there was, so it was a simulation, but they were using real networks. They broke into a power plant, and they were one keystroke away from taking one of those big giant generators at the power plant, which spins at, a gazillion RPMs. They were one keystroke away from sending that spinning thing, multi-ton giant turbine off kilter just enough that it would have shredded itself, completely torn itself apart, and probably physically destroyed most of that power plant. Because when giant, multi-ton, huge, gigantic things are spinning that fast, and you knock it off balance even a little bit, that is huge physical destruction. So those are a big deal. Those, all these systems can be controlled by bad people. And if bad people get control, they're able to cause a lot of destruction. And frankly, I'm kind of astonished that it hasn't happened more often up until this point. So what are the big groups that we have to be worried about? Well, there's essentially an infinite number. I mean, there are all kinds of horrible terrorist groups, from the political left, the political right, all basically major religions. Like, there are horrible groups in all of those areas. And they're all people who want to use the internet for nefarious purposes, right? So ALF and ELF, that's the Animal Liberation Front and the ELF Liberation Front, they're kind of left-wing environmentalists who use destruction and terroristic acts to fight against construction and development of wild areas and animal testing and all those kinds of things. The alt-right is the right-wing, white nationalist, neo-Nazi, all that kind of thing. They use the internet to radicalize young men, especially young white men here in the United States, organize rallies, organize, giant mass protest attacks and terrorist incidents. As I'm recording this, there was just a Coast Guard lieutenant who was radicalized by the alt-right and had a whole bunch of guns and ammunition and a plan to attack a bunch of Democratic politicians. The e-jihad, i.e. a radical Muslim group using the internet to perform, anti, essentially religions other than Islam attacks, whether it's against, Israel or the United States or Western Europe. They are targeting essentially anybody that's not Muslim. And then, of course, there's Anonymous from 4chan, which is kind of the most loosely, it's difficult to even call them a group because all the groups above have at least some kind of hierarchy or leadership or organization, whereas Anonymous is completely disorganized. There is no leadership. There is no organization of any kind. But they have performed a heck of a lot of acts. Some of them I would describe as hacktivism attacks that I fully support. A lot of them are really horrible things that I would never support. So they're a very weird one. But I did feel compelled to put them in amongst these groups that we have to be careful of. But anyway, we will talk in the next subsection about cyber war. See you then.